in the earlier 2010s, around the same time period that we're talking about, where it was like really prime creatively for like the left field instrumental hip hop beat music scene. And they were like making so much cool stuff, and Brainfeeder Records was like putting out one album after another, after another, after another.
Yeah.
And, even though some of these projects didn't necessarily hold up as album pieces per se, people were just like eating it up and loving it.
Hey, we used to share a lot of that stuff on Bringing Down the Band. I have so many obscure. That's one of the genres that we used to push really heavy, was just the beat. Try to push music producers and whatever this instrumental type of thing was. But this is before these playlists existed and all this other stuff. I have stuff on my hard drive that I know like very few people have out there.
And then eventually through Spotify and through, things like these YouTube streams, like, someone in chat just mentioned, like there is, as you said, this flattening of all of this stuff. And it sort of like ends up screaming louder than the original scene itself.
That's exactly what happened. The most fascinating, interesting, kind of confusing thing that people were okay with was when this whole like music to study or lo-fi beats to study by or study for, all this stuff started popping out. What happened is people started caring more about the music itself as opposed to who was making the music. And in one way that's kind of cool, I guess, like if it's good, it's good. Who cares who made it? But it almost like completely erased the artist. So there was no way to get back to find who the original artist was anymore.
For this music, and it sort of becomes like people's conception and perception of the genres. And when they want to go to listen to these, sorts of sounds, they'll go to Spotify first, or they'll go to a YouTube study beats playlist first. And as a result, all of these artists who've been making these records, they're sort of being drowned out. And now there's absolutely no money anymore for them to actually make these albums, unless they get placed on one of these playlists. But,
that's a very big, it's extremely niche right now. There's still people making it, but even still, like I don't see a lot of. I feel like there was quite a bit of a decent little push for instrumental music for a while, and it still exists. Don't get it twisted, because I obviously still release it, and there's a lot of us that still release it, but it's just it really got watered down. It really got watered down.
Yeah, and just to kind of like respond to something that you just said too, to me, there's this small section in that chapter that I just mentioned where I kind of interviewed a bunch of producers who have made music in the lo-fi hip hop space, who talked about the impact that hosticification has had on that scene over the years. And I think that something that really stuck with me was one of the producers that I interviewed talked about how in the streaming era, it became really easy to reach a really wide audience through these curated playlists, but it became harder to make meaningful connections or feel that you had that anyone listening, would remember your artist project, or that listening to these playlists would cause anyone to go actually research who the artists on the playlists were.
Yep.
And this has happened with various different scenes over the years, where the prominence of a really popular playlist will make it, easier for people to become fans of a specific playlist or a sound, and not necessarily dig further into learning about the artists on those playlists. And I think that severing of the relationship between listener and artist that sometimes happens when streaming platforms shape listening behavior around their own discovery.
And this is also why it's a very, very important thing for independent artists that don't have big followings to really focus on the crowdsourcing, or not even necessarily crowdsourcing, but on a model that is related to direct to consumer. Streaming should not be your main thing if you are an independent artist. Sometimes I don't even know if streaming should be a thing at all. Number one, streaming doesn't pay enough to really care. You have to stream a lot, number one, for it to really matter. But two, it's more so important that you focus on trying to build relationships with fans.
Prioritizing content that is cheaper for them, which I think is one of the main reasons why, tech companies and the music business is interested in AI music, is because there's this promise of cheaper content. And that's certainly, as people who care about music, like something to be critical of. I guess one other thing I always like to point out with the conversations about generative AI and AI also more broadly is that, there are a lot of concerns and there's a lot of hype around generative AI right now. And it's absolutely legitimate, artists and people who care about music should be really concerned with the ways in which music is being used without artists' consent in training generative AI music systems in order to create cheaper content and display in these curatorial systems. I also think it's important to remember all of the ways that AI and machine learning have reshaped the way that we discover music and understand music, and the way meaning is created in music through things like algorithmic recommendation and this kind of, like I talk about in the introduction, this kind of like mechanized way of listening to music or discovering music that has become advanced in the streaming era.
Yeah, there's even in regards to the AI music on the platform, a pretty hilarious part of the book where you draw like, or you kind of dig up a really funny irony that, there are sort of found instances of AI music on the platform being streamed or sort of like engaged with by bots. So you just like literally have robots listening to robots. There's like literally no fucking human in the loop at any point.
That's crazy.
Yeah, that was, I thought, like a really telling example of, I think in the book I ask, like, is this kind of just like the logical conclusion of where all these like mechanized ways of thinking about making music?
That's interesting. Like, that's my dude TR who talked about, he put me up on like the dead internet theory and everything else about like how most of the people that were interacting, I'm probably butchering this too, but the idea that a lot of the interactions, a lot of the comment sections are no longer human beings, right? And so we think that we're engaging with people in real time. We think that real people are listening to our music, that are watching our videos, but realistically, it's just bots. Or it's AI to some degree. Like Meta even said that to fix some sort of, to make it so that people felt like their posts mattered on Threads, that they were going to create fake accounts that seemed like real people to interact with us on Threads. Like, that's not the point.
And listening to music leads to eventually.
I mean, I guess if bots are going to come out and start buying my album with Mark Zuckerberg's money or Elon Musk's money or something like that, I guess I'm okay with it. You know what I mean? But like, otherwise, what are we doing?
No, I mean, people are bringing up in the chat the dead internet theory, which I mean does like kind of connect to this for sure. I kind of see like three big tiers of the industry at this point, and they're the record labels, you have the streaming services, and you also have the distros, like DistroKid and kind of the middlemen who are sort of like facilitating a lot of this like uploading to these platforms to kind of get musicians and get people on to these various places. Do you think this hierarchy is going to remain this way forever? Because at least for me, in my view, it sort of seems like at least one of these three doesn't need to exist. And eventually at some point, as dog eat dog capitalism,
I think it's the distribution companies.
Always gradually, and eventually at some point, as dog eat dog capitalism, always gradually does, like one ends up swallowing the other. And I don't know, for me, maybe it's the distros, but who may it be in your opinion? Do you think eventually one of these three will get absorbed into the other and we'll see even more consolidation of the music industry?
Something that I talk about in the introduction and try to make clear throughout the book is that a lot of when we're criticizing streaming services or talking about streaming services, you're also talking about the major record labels who are partners in, many ways to these companies.
Yeah, they are connected, and they have a stake in the company as far as stocks and everything, to the tune of millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah, the major labels make so much money off of the streaming ecosystem. The streaming model, as we know it, could not exist without the cooperation and participation of the major record labels. So in a lot of ways, like the types of industry practices that we're talking about and the dynamics that we're talking about, it's, as I write in the introduction, like it's as much about what's stayed the same as it is about what's changed. The major labels have incredible influence and power in the music business. It's hard to imagine a situation where that is not true unless there's some sort of like, massive wave of antitrust action or some sort of like efforts to, investigate and sort of regulate these companies. So it's hard to imagine like that not being the case. Something that is interesting is that you see like, something else I say is that a lot of the economics of streaming and the story of streaming, I think, could be understood as a fight for market share. And, the labels and the major rights holders, because of the pro rata model in which rights holders get paid through streaming, rights holders are always trying to grow their market share, or as streaming services call it, stream share, like the number of total streams that they have on a platform in a given royalty period. And because of that, you've seen like a lot of investment on the major labels, from the major labels into like independent distributors and these sort of like, companies that allow independent labels to have more of a foot in like the so-called like DIY distribution realm. So I don't really like to futurecast or make predictions about like these sort of big players in the music business, but it's not hard to imagine a world where the major labels just like continue trying to buy up and consolidate more corners of independent distribution. And
yeah, I mean, in the book, you do cite instances at least of like the labels taking interest in sort of like owning some of these distros. And, it all sort of, it seems like there is at least some consolidation for sure at play. But something I've always kind of like questioned about Spotify's presentation versus almost any other streaming platform is why do you think they make such a big deal of like posting the numbers on the platform in terms of like, yeah, these are the monthly listeners, and not just for the artists, of course, like they would see them, but these are the monthly listeners for your favorite artist, and here's how each song is, getting streamed and how many hits it has and so on and so forth. And, usually I don't see that being so much the case on other platforms. And given Spotify's lack of transparency on pretty much every other issue, and also like, the major labels' various connections and monetary vested interests in Spotify, like, do we even have reason as outsiders to trust any of these numbers? Like, could all of this be totally made the fuck up? Or
that's an interesting question.
Or is it like verified in any way outside of like, some reporting to the Music Industry of America and the Association of American? Oh yeah, this one.
I mean, I guess the verification would be like, if I'm an artist, I could check my statistics, right? I could check my statistics and see kind of like if they match to some degree.
Platinum, it's doing really well. It's great. So yeah, I mean, should we trust these numbers, or is there reasoning behind showing these numbers to the public on Spotify's part?
We definitely should like question the value of these numbers. Like I always say, like, streaming metrics, data that comes from streaming services isn't necessarily data about music. It's data about that streaming service. It's data about, what does well on those streaming services, what sort of thing is prioritized in that specific environment. There's so many examples of, artists that have horrible streaming numbers, but that, could play a sold out show in New York to 250 people. And then examples of musicians that have millions of streams that if they did a show in New York, like not even 10 people would show up. And I think that's one of the really strange things about how streaming metrics, if you talk to musicians, they'll tell you that streaming metrics have become such like an important part of how they get booked, or if certain like people in the music industry will take them seriously, when we know that like there's such like a indirect correlation between what these numbers can actually tell us about like true fandom and musical community. So yeah. I definitely think that it makes sense that they're so prominent for streaming services, because in a lot of ways, kind of like the core way in which these services determine value. Like if these services are driven by a need to, to bolster engagement, like everything that they do is driven by wanting to boost user engagement, keep people streaming more, keep people, extend listening sessions. So it makes sense that there would be this kind of,
I feel like in a way, it's also a way that the streaming platform, like, in itself could, like, it's like almost like Spotify is trying to create parasocial relationships with people and the entities that are streaming something on the platform to grow the metrics. But it's like this like Squid Game in the middle of like trying to do this just to keep people like on the platform. Because it's just like every other platform. Spotify wants to keep people on their platform, because the longer people exist in a particular time on their platform, the more ads they get run, the more money they make. So I feel like there's some super scientific things going on there with that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest half-truths that I see all the time in terms of like the monthly listener numbers on any given artist page is like, you'll go to an artist page, you'll see they have a certain amount of monthly listeners, and you'll see the tracks that are sort of like getting them that kind of engagement. And sometimes over and over and over, it'll be features on other people's songs, and you and I as music fans know that doesn't.
Or it'll be something that's like a one-off that happened to be on a playlist or something like that. It's
necessarily always sort of like translate to an actual fan who's engaging with your stuff. People may be streaming that track that you're featured on because they're a fan of that artist that you collaborated with. And yet on a lot of these platforms, including Spotify, this is like showcases this is this artist's work, this thing that they featured on. And, this we sort of consider to be like a prime piece of their catalog, even though it may just be like a guest appearance, and it sort of like counts toward their overall monthly engagement with everyone, as if, something like, let's say, I don't know, a Drake feature, for example. Drake has been known to sort of like be this guy who, for a quick moment, he drives a lot of people into the direction of a certain person or a certain figure or a certain artist by having them feature on a track, and they blow up for a minute, and then, it sort of ramps down pretty quickly. And it sort of seems like, in a way, like the streaming services are kind of like also, I don't know, part of that web effect, that domino effect of like, this person has 11 million monthly listeners on Spotify, but as you say, they try to book a tour and they have to cancel the whole thing because they can't.
Because 10.5 million of those are from a Drake feature.
Fill up the venues that they're booking.
A really popular playlist, and the consumption numbers might be high because a lot of people are listening to that one playlist. But who is actually clicking out of that playlist and going and researching this artist? And I think it's definitely the numbers ought to be questioned. And I think it's important. It's important to remember that like these metrics like do not equal value. That value is determined by so many different things, and different people value different things about music, and there's different reasons why people make music. There's different
Streaming platforms are cool. They're almost like just marketing tools at this point. Spotify is a marketing tool. I've talked many times about me taking most all of my music is off of Spotify, except for like collaborative albums I've done or feature stuff like that. Like, I don't put any of my music on Spotify anymore. And it's multifold, and I'm not going to go into the super details on it here, but one of the main reasons, or one of the main things, is like, you can't really touch, as an independent artist, like, you can get lucky and get on a playlist. You can get lucky and blow up off of some stuff like this. But to me, it's like this pyramid that I always like to talk about. You can get a lot of views at the top of the pyramid, but those views aren't necessarily fans. That's the next area of or they're not necessarily followers. You know what I mean? And below, even further on that pyramid, are like the people that found you, became a follower, but then actually like you enough to like want to interact with you. And you can't really get to that bottom level on a streaming platform. You kind of have to have some sort of ownership, some sort of something created, some sort of community type of feature to where you can engage with people, whether that's a mailing list or whether that's a Patreon or whether that's a membership feature on an app like this, or it's a Discord server where you can connect with people and actually engage with them. Like, you really kind of have to create that type of thing to grab those people that really want to rock with you. Otherwise, they're just going to be kind of like onlookers that's going to catch you every once in a while. You know what I mean? And if you're super independent, I would look at Spotify more as a marketing tool and less as a way to get big.
Reasons why people listen to music, and not every single person who makes music is trying to,
It's just like there's a cap. You just can't hit certain. There's just no personal relationship building there. There's nothing within like Spotify that's really going to connect me with somebody that makes me like really want to invest in who this person is.
Be a pop star, or like, the goal isn't always just, limitless growth. And that's one of the things about this environment that I think is like, super challenging for independent musicians or people who make music where maybe the goal is like sustainability and not just endless growth, is that these are platforms that are designed specifically for music that scales, both like financially and then also just in terms of like how music ends up being.
That's a good point too. Like, looking at this from an angle of like, just looking at like the scalability and growth.
Surfaced in the recommendation algorithms and things like that.
No, and a part of that infinite scale and that growth and that value that Spotify sells musicians on is this idea of like, you can build your fan base here and you can get exposure here. And one of the platform's new mechanisms.
I think Anthony's going to touch on what I was going to go deeper on.
For doing that, as you discuss deeply in the book, and even sort of like cite its connections to the history of payola, is their whole discovery mode thing, where either a label on your behalf or you as an independent artist agree,
which I opted out of for reasons back when I was still on Spotify through my distribution company,
to give Spotify an even larger share of money made from streaming your tracks in exchange for, potentially like more exposure of that song to the broader public. But I kind of wanted to ask you, because, you don't definitively say this in the book, not to my recollection anyway, but like, were there any instances in which in your research you actually found this to have worked for somebody who is like, maybe on the more independent end of the spectrum? Because giving so many artists such wide access to such a promise and such a program, I would imagine, would just sort of like, get millions of people through the door, like, yeah, have my track exposed to more people, have this track, like, again, millions and millions of tracks. Wouldn't that theoretically just create more noise? Does that actually end up exposing any of this music to a wider swath of people at the end of the day? Like, I imagine.
I don't think it does when you get down to, like, I feel like you can get a lot of that top end exposure, but does that actually convert?
Even know where to silo these tracks to people to get them to fucking listen to them?
And that's one of the questions that came up a lot in interviews with people who work at independent record labels. And also it's questions that have been publicly posed to the company in other, op-eds and open letters and things over the years. Is this idea that, okay, well, one, with a program like this, does it mean that then if everyone else is enrolled in it and I'm not, then does it affect me because I'm not enrolled in this? And then also, what if everyone enrolls at the same time? Like, could we all?
It's the same idea of like YouTube Premium or Twitch Premium, right? If everybody gets Twitch Premium, Twitch Premium can't function as a service for Twitch anymore because they can't make enough money off ads to actually to work.
Once everyone's doing it, there's no priority.
Yeah, except we're all taking the lower royalty rate. So it seems to, we know like who that would work out well in favor of. And yeah, I think that one thing I heard from some independent record labels is that the frustrating thing about it was that, when they did enroll in it, they did see a boost in like the track that they would enroll on it, but in exchange for a lower royalty rate. And it sort of puts independent artists and labels in this position where they feel like, maybe pressured to enroll in programs like this or to take advantage of these like so-called promotional opportunities.
Exposure points, man. Give me some exposure points.
It's also not just discovery mode, there's also like banner ads and like, things like that the company sort of sells to musicians as so-called promotional opportunities. That, according to people I interviewed, there is sort of, a sense that, there's maybe like a pressure to want to participate in these things. But
there definitely was a pressure, and I definitely said no. But I definitely felt that pressure when they came out because everybody was like, yeah, this is a good thing that you need. I'm like, is it though?
I just don't, it's hard to see it financially working out to the benefit of most independent musicians.
Yeah, no, and the banner ads and the advertisements in general that you mentioned are just like wild to me in terms of like what little success Spotify has seen in terms of like, using that as a mode of profit on the platform. Because as you say in the book, Spotify pretty openly acknowledges that like so many of these playlists are based off of lean back listening, background listening. Like how is Spotify actually able to sell advertisers on, spend millions of dollars getting your advertisements to the ears of our listeners when they openly admit to music fans, investors, everybody that like, people just basically have our shit on in the background and don't really pay attention to it. It sort of seems like, the antithesis of what an advertiser would want in terms of getting people to engage with their product.
Well, the way they kind of hype it up is that, because people have our service on all day, we have all different sorts of data about like different things that they're doing throughout the day. So they sort of like
all day, and also in the book, as you say, all night, because you talked about people at the company being like really hyped. It's like, we have these really popular sleep playlists. People just have this shit on while they're sleeping. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was a really funny part of the reporting.
It's like different ways to make money, but not different ways to actually grow a connection with somebody as an artist.
But as someone in chat said, it's really quantity over quality. And, kind of an irony to all this is another thing that I remember early on in the years of Spotify, and maybe you could speak to this a little bit, is how quickly they ended up nipping in the bud some of these artists, independent artists that found ways to kind of game the system by like, we're going to put a random silence album on the platform or a white noise album, and you guys will stream that and then generate us money for our next record, for a tour.
Hey man, I spent about 6 months really diving deep into the YouTube content ID system and trying to understand it because there wasn't a lot of information out there as far as music is concerned. And I did a very, very large deep dive to figure out if there was a way to trick the system that was tricking me. Wasn't very successful in it, but I did research that heavily because that's what's happening to us anyways as musicians. It's like these platforms exist only because the music is there. Yeah. But at the same time, it's like they get away with feeling as if and acting as if they are super important to the process of music. But if Spotify goes away, if these streaming platforms go away, it's going to be an inconvenience for the consumer. But the consumer are eventually going to figure out other ways to consume the things that they want to, and other things are going to exist. We just put too much power into these platforms in general.
Tour, whatever. And it sort of seems like though Spotify actively, stamped all of that out and said, this is bad, this isn't true to what our platform does. It sort of seems like they turned around and just are doing that exact same thing for themselves.
And this is, I feel like not just Spotify, but also the major labels and other platforms like do this too, like there's often this dynamic amongst like major power players in music, like you don't get to exploit artists, like only we get to do that. Or like, you don't get to like, streaming metrics through sleep playlists, like only we get to do that.
Like that's the biggest secret of it all. I mean, that's not a secret at all. It's like it's all exploitative. All of it is. We're just choosing which level of exploitation we're okay with. I love YouTube in general as a platform, but it's also exploitative on a major level. It's just a little bit less exploitative and a little bit more transparent than other platforms.